What happened to the four children of Patricia Kennedy Lawford, the poised, soft-spoken sister of JFK who carried the burden of Camelot's fall, and Peter Lawford, the silver screen Rat Pack icon who partied with Sinatra and whispered secrets between Hollywood and Washington? Their children were born into the blinding collision of two American dynasties, the Kennedys and the Rat Pack, but beneath the shimmering veil of privilege were childhoods shaped by assassinations, addiction, broken marriages, and the haunting ache of being famous by blood, not by choice. This is not a story about political campaigns or movie premieres. It's about what happened after the limelight dimmed, about four siblings who had to find themselves under the weight of surnames they never asked for. And it begins, as it should, with the firstborn son, a boy who learned to grieve in public long before he ever understood what he was grieving for. Christopher Kennedy Lawford was born March 29, 1955, into a world that didn't whisper, it roared. His godfather was legendary actor Judy Garland's husband. His nursery walls may as well have been papered in White House stationery and MGM studio contracts. Marilyn Monroe taught him to dance in the living room. Sinatra knew his name before he could spell it. He was in every way a child of the American dreams. Two flashiest departments, politics and Hollywood. But by the time he was 8, the dream was splintering. The day John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Christopher was at school. He would later recall, in hushed tones, how he learned his uncle, the President of the United States, had been shot. 5 years later, it happened again. Another uncle, Robert F. Kennedy, murdered in a hotel kitchen. Christopher was 13 that time. He was old enough to understand the sound of shattering glass. It wasn't just the Kennedy dynasty collapsing in front of America's eyes. It was his family. And somewhere between the white funeral gloves and the television cameras, Christopher stopped believing in fairy tales. He carried that grief into manhood, but first into rebellion. By 14, he was experimenting with LSD. Not long after, it escalated into alcohol, cocaine, pills, heroin, anything to drown the ache and scramble the identity he never quite felt he owned. He once said that addiction, for him, wasn't just to substances. It was to fame itself, to validation, to being a Kennedy, but never quite Kennedy enough. His parents divorced in 1966, another quiet rupture in a life filled with televised ones. The Lawfords were crumbling at home, just as the country watched Camelot fall apart in real time. Christopher went through College Tufts University, followed by Boston College Law School, but floundered. He failed the bar. He drifted. He interned for his Uncle Ted. Tried politics, but it didn't stick. Law felt hollow. The shadow of his last name followed him like a ghost. So he pivoted again this time, toward his father's world, toward acting from the 1980s through the early 2000s. Christopher built a career on screen that was steady but modest. You could find him in All My Children, Frasier, The Doors, Terminator 3 and 13 Days, where he played a naval commander in a film about the Cuban Missile Crisis, a political storm his family had once actually lived through. He was solid, reliable, but never headline-worthy. Not like his father and not like his uncles. Hollywood made room for him, but never worshipped him. So again, he pivoted this time, inward. By the late 1980s, addiction had nearly destroyed him. He had lied, stolen, cheated, manipulated. He had impersonated a doctor to score drugs and gotten arrested. Only family name and connections kept him from prison, but even the Kennedy armor has cracks, and when his cousin David Robert F. Kennedy's son died of an overdose in 1984, Christopher couldn't run anymore. The grief was too familiar, too close. David's death became his reckoning. Christopher entered recovery that year and never looked back. He would remain sober for the next 3 decades, and out of that sobriety came clarity, and then a new identity. He wrote first Symptoms of Withdrawal, a raw, unflinching memoir that didn't flinch from shame. He laid it all bare, the lies, the drugs, the way he used the Kennedy name as a currency to destroy himself. It became a New York Times bestseller. He wrote more books after that about addiction, about recovery, about how to rebuild a self when the old one was shaped by legacy rather than choice. He said once, "My greatest liabilities became my greatest assets." And he meant it. He took the pieces of himself that nearly killed him and turned them into purpose. He traveled the country, spoke at treatment centers, worked with the UN and White House offices on addiction policy. He wasn't trying to be a Kennedy anymore. He was trying to be a human being. Christopher was married 3 times. With his first wife, Jeannie Olson, he had 3 children: David, Savannah, and Matthew. His oldest son was named after the cousin he lost to drugs. He was proud that his kids only knew him as a father in recovery. He told interviewers he never expected redemption, but found it anyway, not in applause, but in the quiet gratitude of being alive, of being clean, of being present. On September 4th, 2018, Christopher Kennedy Lawford died suddenly from a heart attack at a yoga studio in Vancouver. He was 63. Some say those 17 brutal years of drug use had finally caught up with his heart. But those who knew him say his real legacy was never in how he died. It was in how he came back, in the way he walked out from under the weight of 2 towering American myths, Kennedy and Lawford, and built something real with his own hands. Not a monument, not a dynasty, but a life. A sober, honest, imperfect, deeply human life. And while Christopher's journey burned bright in the public eye, his sister Sydney, the next Lawford child, would choose an entirely different path. One of quiet dignity, family devotion, and a fierce resistance to spectacle. But the shadow of legacy doesn't fade just because you walk away from the stage. It waits at the edge of every decision. Sydney knew this too well. If Sydney was the family's quiet anchor, then Victoria was its echo, not in volume, but in depth. Born on November 4th, 1958, Santa Monica, California, Victoria Frances Lawford entered a world still vibrating with the glamour of her father's Hollywood heyday and the political voltage of the Kennedy dynasty. By the time she could walk, her uncle had become the President of the United States. By the time she could read, her family had already lived through its first assassination. She grew up with velvet carpeting under her feet and secrets in the wallpaper. Yet unlike her brother, who fought to write his way out of legacy, or her sister who silently stepped around it, Victoria embraced a different path, one that required no press releases, no memoirs, and no public reckoning. It was the most radical choice of all. She chose to live as a mother. Victoria's childhood unfolded against a backdrop of presidential portraits and Rat Pack after-parties. She was christened in Washington, D.C., her godfather a Kennedy senator, her baby photos possibly framed next to headlines about Vietnam or Watergate. She came of age just as the fight of American innocence cracked wide open, watching as uncles became martyrs and cousins became headlines. But while others in her family pursued activism, performance, or politics, Victoria kept her gaze turned inward. When she married Robert B.B. Pender Jr., she took the Lawford name into the private chambers of family life. Together they had 3 daughters, Alexandra, Caroline, and Victoria Rose, and moved in a direction that, for the Kennedys, was almost subversive in its simplicity. They prioritized home. There was little drama in the public record of Victoria's adult life, and that's no accident. She was never a fixture at red carpet events or the subject of investigative journalism. Instead, she became a homemaker, a term that in the Kennedy world doesn't carry the flash of a Senate run or a best-selling memoir, but perhaps more courage. To raise children under a name that still echoes through American history is no small task. And yet, she did deliberately, quietly, effectively. While she kept herself out of the media's gaze, the men around her operated at the highest levels. Her husband co-founded Venture Global LNG, a dominant player in the liquefied natural gas market. He led major international law efforts and held roles in both the Senate and the White House counsel's office. And their eldest daughter, Alexandra, carried forward the Kennedy service ethos, just not in the same arenas. Alexandra Lawford Pender, born in 1988, came of age in a more fractured but equally politicized America. Her work with kids in need of defense, KIND, an organization that supports unaccompanied immigrant children, shows a deep commitment to the kind of ground-level justice that once motivated her great-uncles. As director of digital media, she helped shape public narratives, but her advocacy was personal too, reflecting both a Kennedy-style compassion and a distinctly modern grasp of policy. She even interned for Senator Edward Kennedy, folding one more generation into the arc of family legacy. The younger daughters, Caroline and Victoria Rose, have kept a lower profile, their stories still unfolding, but if their mother's example holds, it's likely they've been raised to navigate power with discretion and visibility with care. Victoria herself has reappeared occasionally at Kennedy events, family tributes, memorial ceremonies, private gatherings. She was part of Sydney's wedding party in 1983 and later seen during annual commemorations for President Kennedy at Arlington National Cemetery. These were not press stunts. They were acts of remembrance. In a family so often pulled apart by ambition and tragedy, simply being there in body, in support, in solidarity mattered. There's no evidence of Victoria leading foundations or launching public campaigns, but she didn't need to. Her daughters, husband, and the quiet continuation of her lineage are testimony enough. Not every Kennedy descendant needs to shout to be heard. Some, like Victoria, understand that in a dynasty built on oratory and spectacle, silence can be its own kind of defiance. Her life, lived beyond the spotlight, becomes a study in restraint, a demonstration that legacy isn't just a matter of speeches or scandals, but of steadiness. In a clan that has birthed senators, actors, and activists, she may have been the most traditional and perhaps the most radical of them all. Yet the story doesn't end here, because there was one more sister, the youngest. Robin, and her path threaded through marine biology, international schooling, and an elusive adult life may be the quietest, but also the most enigmatic of them all. Robin Elizabeth Lawford was born into a moment of strange calm between storms. It was July in 1961, JFK had just taken office, and for a brief flicker in American history, Camelot seemed real. In photos from her early childhood, Robin appears like a child plucked from two worlds, the coastal ease of Santa Monica and the razor-sharp formality of Georgetown. Her godfather was Robert F. Kennedy, then the U.S. Attorney General. Her godmother was Veronica Rocky Cooper, the widow of actor Gary Cooper. In other words, her birthright wasn't just famous. It was symbolically balanced between justice and stardom. But Robin would take that legacy in a wholly different direction. While her siblings chose advocacy, family life, or recovery, Robin quietly slipped into the deep, the oceans, the reefs, the microscopic balance of marine ecosystems. She studied biology, not politics, and she built a life not around the family name, but in defiance of its gravitational pull. By the time Robin was old enough to form permanent memories, her family was already unraveling JFK's assassination in 1963, when she was only 2, may not have left a conscious imprint, but its shadows hung in every room she grew up in. By the time RFK was killed in 1968, she was just 7, old enough to feel the fear, the confusion, the collective silence that fell across every adult in her orbit. The Lawford household, once a midpoint between Capitol Hill and the Beverly Hills Hotel, became a fractured sanctuary. Her parents, Peter Lawford and Patricia Kennedy, divorced in 1966. Her older siblings carried the scars in different ways. Christopher through addiction and eventual redemption, Sydney through quiet service, Victoria through guarded family focus. But Robin, the youngest, the least photographed, seemed to instinctively step away. She wasn't going to battle the legacy, she would simply live outside of it. She graduated from the United Nations International School in New York City, a fitting beginning for someone destined to think globally. Later, she pursued marine biology, becoming, according to the few records that exist, a quiet but respected figure in the field. There are no viral interviews, no memoirs, no public cries for legacy, no glossy features in Vanity Fair. Just the rare mentions in magazines or obituaries where she's listed as Robin Elizabeth Lawford, marine biologist based in New York. That's all, and that's the point. To be born a Kennedy Lawford and yet be anonymous is almost impossible. But Robin appears to have made it a mission. Still, she never fully disappeared from the family tapestry. In the 70s and 80s, she attended fundraisers for her Uncle Ted Kennedy, charity events like the Arts for the Handicapped benefit, and even showed up on the red carpet at select film premieres. She wasn't anti-family, just anti-spectacle. Later in life, she joined a 2002 family trip to Cuba to mark the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a quiet acknowledgement of history rather than a public performance over time. Her appearances became more rare, her name less searchable. It's unclear whether she married or had children. But what's certain is that she found her calling not in the legacy of her parents, but in the rhythms of tides and the science of life beneath the surface. In a strange way, Robin may have achieved the most freedom of all the Lawford children. Christopher spent decades battling the public expectations that came with his last name, turning pain into purpose. Sidney chose private devotion, building a life around service and motherhood. Victoria curated distance, finding grace in invisibility. But Robin, she built a life that didn't need to react to anything. She simply opted out. And in doing so, she offered a kind of quiet blueprint for legacy children everywhere. You don't have to perform or apologize or compete. You can just live, and perhaps that's the most radical legacy of all. Because in a family haunted by assassinations, addiction, broken marriages, and public scrutiny, the act of living peacefully, purposefully, and mostly unrecorded might be the truest rebellion. While her brother's words live in memoirs and speeches, while her sister's children carry forward the Kennedy spirit in philanthropy and service, Robin's story exists somewhere in the tide pools of Long Island Sound or the coral surveys off the Pacific coast unwritten, but no less profound. As the curtain gently falls on the children of Patricia Kennedy and Peter Lawford, one thing becomes clear. Legacy does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it walks barefoot through sand rather than marble corridors. And sometimes it chooses silence, not because it has nothing to say, but because it understands the power of staying still when the whole world expects you to shine. If you enjoyed this story, there's more where that came from. We'll be exploring the private, untold family stories behind the biggest names in Hollywood. So don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching.